longer.
Sir Charles, do you think history is going to judge that Maastricht is a distraction from the much greater events that have been happening further east?
Yes, I do think that. I really do believe it. You see, I think what has happened in the last 12 months has been the division of Europe, which we got used to for 40 years, has suddenly disappeared. The Iron Curtain has been torn down. And now in Maastricht, I think there's a danger of emphasizing that there are really two Europes. One which is moving rather fast towards union, even towards, in the eyes of some people, towards federation. And the other side, a turbulent, poverty-stricken, chaotic Europe, which will feel that we're turning our backs on it. I don't think that ought to be allowed to happen. I think we need to have much more focus in the EC on what's happening in Eastern Europe. We ought to be devising structures which would help East Europe come closer to Western Europe. Otherwise, we'll end up with a sort of I'm all right, Jack attitude about ourselves, and we shall pay for it in the turbulence and the unsettled conditions we'll find in Eastern Europe. And that could be very damaging in the longer term.
Monsieur Chesson, would you agree with that? Do you think we could see the creation of two Europes, a rich, I'm all right, Jack West, and a poor, fragmented East?
Once more, I agree with Sir Charles, but once more I want to go further, or deeper than he does. Have you noticed that in Yugoslavia, the line of division between the Serbs on the one hand, the Croatians and the Slovenians on the other hand, is exactly the ultimate border of the Ottoman Empire, is exactly the limit to which the former Roman Germanic Empire extended. Aren't we going to find that line further north? I don't know yet. And if the division between the two Europes, of which Sir Charles was talking very rightly, were that historical division, then I think it would be very, very dangerous too. Then also I wonder how the Slavs of Eastern Europe are going to react in their contact, that's another statement, with the Slavs of Russia and neighboring countries. So all that is very worrying, yes. But after I have said that, I shall immediately add, although you haven't asked the question, what can we do?
All right, how would you answer your own question?
I can't.
Let me ask you something else then. Do you think that in future years, Maastricht will come to be seen as a bit of a diversion from the really important events that were happening in 1991?
Not at all, not at all. Maastricht is a very, very welcome development of the solidarity between us that will enable Germans and French not to be at war again, as would have happened without Maastricht, probably.
Sir Charles, brings us to the question of a wider or a deeper Western Europe. Which would you go for?
I think we have to give priority now to the wider Europe. The EFTA countries already want to join the EC, or most of them do. The Eastern European countries can't join fully now. They can't take the full burdens of membership, but we need to bring them closer. And above all, we need to give them the opportunity to trade with Europe, because that's the only way they're ever going to make themselves prosperous. It's by trade. Pouring money in won't help all that much. Money can get spent very quickly on a lot of fairly useless things, let's be honest about it. But trade is the one way. And if we build new barriers around the EC, if we say the common agricultural policy makes it impossible for them to export tomatoes or strawberries or whatever into Europe, then we're doing ourselves a great disservice, because we shall be continuing that instability in Eastern Europe, from which we have much to fear.
Very briefly, you don't think, as Monsieur Chesson was suggesting, that we will have a line drawn with the former Muslim empires, and that could be very dangerous?
Well, I think Mr. Chesson's absolutely right to look back into history and look for the seeds of these conflicts. But I think, in a sense, we've got a much more immediate task now. It's to try to come up with some really positive measures which will help in this situation, not just to analyse it, but actually do something about it.
Sir Charles, Monsieur Chesson, thank you very much indeed. And now a quick look at the rest of the day's news. The High Court has frozen the personal
from Moscow over whether President Gorbachev is about to resign. His chief spokesman says the Soviet leader has no plans to step down. Another advisor had said earlier Mr. Gorbachev would resign soon. Speculation about Mr. Gorbachev's future has been growing since 3 of the most powerful republics declared their intention to form a commonwealth of independent states.
In the Kremlin tonight, the suggestions are that Mikhail Gorbachev is at least considering whether he should now step down. He hasn't made a public appearance since this interview at the weekend, when the Slavic states of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine decided to go behind his back and form their own Commonwealth of independent states. Today, one of Mr. Gorbachev's closest advisors, Georgy Shakhnazarov, told this meeting in Moscow that both the president and his team may resign. The decision will be made soon, he said. While in a BBC interview, a Gorbachev spokesman revealed the president's thinking about what else he might do should he agree to go.
Today he said to one of his aides that he has some ways to occupy himself if something happens.
If he were to resign, he would find something else to do.
Yes, sure, no problem, I suppose.
The dramatic agreement between Boris Yeltsin and the other Slavic leaders means there is precious little power left in the hands of Mr. Gorbachev. His friend and foreign minister, Edvard Shevardnadze, said today that it hadn't quite been a coup against the president, but that the Soviet leader had been denied the power that is his lawful right. Amid mounting speculation that Mr. Gorbachev might go, his chief spokesman told a news conference that the president has no thought of resignation today. But is he still in charge of Russia, Belarus and Ukraine?
Mr. Gorbachev considers himself to be the president of the USSR, which certainly comprises the three states that you mentioned, and I think that he has good reason to think so.
The official line is that the president is determined to stay on and fight to keep his country together. The reality, though, is that every day more and more power is seeping from his grasp. Outside the Kremlin this evening, there was some unexpected support for Mr. Gorbachev from hardline communists demanding the preservation of the old Union and opposing the new Commonwealth. Even so, the president's position, which has looked difficult ever since the coup, now looks impossible. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
The agreement between Boris Yeltsin and the other Slav leaders may be bad news for Mr. Gorbachev, but it's already brought a reprieve for Soviet shoppers. Food prices will not be freed next week, as Mr. Yeltsin wanted, but only on January the 2nd. In the longer term, the plan for a Commonwealth will be judged on its results.
What difference does it make? The important thing is they give us enough to eat.
This woman thought unity among the Slav nations might make life a little better. But for thousands of bureaucrats in Moscow's centralized ministries, the future looks uncertain. Already, they're not sure who they work for, Russia or a Soviet Union that's been declared dead. Mr. Yeltsin's Commonwealth plan means ministry employees will either lose their jobs or have to move 500 miles west to the Belarusian capital, Minsk, headquarters of the new community. But diplomats in the foreign ministry dispute Mr. Yeltsin's assertion that it no longer exists.
Well, it doesn't look like it because everybody is working and the rate of work increased, if not remained the same.
This diplomat says he believes there'll always be work for him, even if he has to move to Minsk.
Why not? Well, I have a Belarusian name, so Minsk will be quite a good place for me too.
There are still plenty of lights burning here at the Foreign Ministry, but if Mr. Gorbachev goes, both it and the other central ministries will probably collapse. The country's entering a twilight zone between the old and the new. What comes next could easily be the chaos and anarchy of which Mr. Gorbachev has repeatedly warned. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
Here, the Serious Fraud Office
said today that, as far as he was concerned, he was still president of the entire Soviet Union, including the republics of Russia, Belarus and the Ukraine, which have formed their own Commonwealth. Earlier, one advisor said it wouldn't be long before Mr. Gorbachev resigned. In the United States, the director of the CIA has warned that the Soviet Union is dangerously unstable.
On the streets of Moscow tonight, a taste of the turbulence to come. Pro-Gorbachev demonstrators sporting the red flag, the symbol of Soviet power, and pro-Yeltsin supporters burning passports, the end of Soviet power. The demonstration followed a day of fevered speculation here in Moscow. First, a trusted Gorbachev ally, Georgy Shekhnazarov, broke ranks, saying, "We may not have long to wait for Mr. Gorbachev's resignation." That prompted a denial from Mr. Gorbachev's official spokesman, but it's done nothing to douse the rumours, particularly as he reiterated the Soviet president's opposition to the 3 breakaway republics.
Mr. Gorbachev considers himself to be the president of the USSR, which certainly comprises the 3 states that you mentioned, and I think that he has good reason to think so.
Tonight, TASS reported Mr. Gorbachev had left the Kremlin to meet top military officials to discuss restructuring the army. He was last seen in public playing host to American businessmen. He and his central government have been stripped of most of their functions by the Republican leaders. If he does resign, the post of president will probably no longer be necessary.
I think that people in the streets will not pay too much attention because their attention has already shifted to other problems.
The problem of finding food for one as winter approaches. This morning, the street talk was not about who's in charge, but rather what country this now is. "It's Russia," said this army major. "No, it's still the Soviet Union," contradicted another. "I haven't a clue what country I'm in," admitted this taxi driver. It was left to Eduard Shevardnadze, the man who predicted the coup, to voice everybody's worst fears. "The situation's running out of control, it's frightening, and I'm scared." The worst aspect of this crisis is the uncertainty. Mr. Gorbachev's apparent determination to hang on in until the bitter end is fueling it, and may only serve to prolong the agony. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Moscow.
Here, 6 people.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin has announced that the republics of Armenia and Kyrgyzia are to join the Commonwealth formed at the weekend by Russia, Belarus and the Ukraine. And in a further weakening of President Gorbachev's power, the Republic of Kazakhstan, which until now has opposed the Commonwealth, is reported to have entered negotiations to join. Today, Mr. Yeltsin met Soviet military commanders to discuss control over the army and its nuclear arsenal. Our Moscow correspondent Gabi Rado reports on another day in the disintegration of the old Soviet Union.
Boris Yeltsin was presented with Siberian diamonds today, a fitting gift on the day his self-appointed prize of a new Commonwealth of independent states all but fell into his lap. He went to the Kremlin to see President Gorbachev, whose resistance to the Minsk agreement had seemed to spark a grave constitutional crisis. But Yeltsin told Russian deputies after this morning's meeting that Gorbachev's mood had changed. He was leaning towards the idea. Then, at another ceremony back at the Russian Federation headquarters, President Yeltsin gave out the news that other republics, including Central Asian ones, which had only yesterday spurned the agreement, were changing their minds too.
Today, Armenia, Kyrgyzia, and I think maybe Kazakhstan and some other republics have announced that they will sign this agreement.
Yeltsin made it known he was ready to fly to meet President Nazarbayev of Kazakhstan in his capital Alma-Ata. Nazarbayev, formerly Gorbachev's weightiest ally, was today fast changing his allegiance to the Russian leader, whose power he used to mistrust. Yeltsin didn't put a foot wrong today. This morning he called in at the All-Union Defense Ministry to reassure military commanders, some of the staunchest supporters of the old Union, that they need have nothing to fear from his new Commonwealth of independent states. The same armed forces chiefs had seen Gorbachev yesterday, but insiders say Yeltsin had more to offer them today.
Mr. Yeltsin just addressed the military today, and this address lasted for almost an hour, some 50 minutes. And certainly it was much more positive, according to the opinion of people, of the military, first of all, with whom I spoke today. They were present yesterday at the meeting with Mr. Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, but they say that President's address, there was nothing new.
That was confirmed by officers leaving the meeting.
The army are more inclined towards what was discussed with Yeltsin. He persuaded us more.
The views of Boris Yeltsin were convincing, and we were very satisfied with the meeting.
Today, especially middle-ranking officers are troubled by the problems of everyday life.
Yeltsin has promised the army a 90% pay rise and said he'll take action to solve its severe accommodation crisis. The once mighty Red Army is now a demoralized force. Hundreds of thousands of troops have been withdrawn from East Europe, and thousands more will have to leave the Baltic states. Many of them now have to live in conditions like these, under canvas, in freezing temperatures. They face soaring inflation and the prospect of losing jobs in forthcoming military cutbacks. The hardline parliamentary deputy, Colonel Victor Alksnis, voices the views of many middle-ranking officers. He has a gloomy view of where the political turmoil is heading.
I
think that the army will inevitably become involved in political processes, but only after a while, in the second stage of a revolution which is now unavoidable. In other words, the scenario will remind us of the February Revolution of 1917, or of the events in Romania 2 years ago.
And of the fate of President Gorbachev, last seen on a pre-recorded TV interview 3 days ago, still no word. Tonight it looks as if Boris Yeltsin will soon be able to present Mr. Gorbachev with a Commonwealth, a new type of union without a role for a union president. The intensity of Mr. Gorbachev's silence may suggest that he's having to consider his position very seriously. Gabirado, ITN, Moscow.
A reminder of this evening's main news so far. Mr. Major has...
Good evening. President Gorbachev has dropped his public opposition to the formation of a new Commonwealth of Soviet states, accepting that the move is constitutionally correct. But he's put his resignation on hold at least until next week. He says he will remain in office for Monday's visit to Moscow by the US Secretary of State James Baker. Mr. Gorbachev spoke twice today to the Russian President Boris Yeltsin, and they agreed that the country's armed forces, especially the nuclear elements, will remain unified, at least for the time being. The new Soviet Commonwealth, founded on Sunday by Russia, Belarus and the Ukraine, is growing. The southern republics of Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan and Tajikistan now want to sign up, though they'll spend a week debating the details. Georgia and Moldova are thought unlikely to join, and Azerbaijan's government says it's in no hurry to become part of the new Commonwealth. From Moscow, Ben Brown reports.
Mikhail Gorbachev was still carrying out his presidential duties today despite the talk of his demise. He met American businessmen and looked jovial and relaxed. Asked when he'll be resigning, his spokesman said it certainly wouldn't be before Monday, when the president's due to see America's Secretary of State James Baker. Today, the Kremlin also announced a dramatic change of heart by Mr. Gorbachev about the new Commonwealth. Apparently, the president no longer thinks it's unconstitutional. In fact, he thinks it's becoming broad and representative. Even for the inconsistent Mr. Gorbachev, that's an astonishing switch from only yesterday, when he bitterly denounced the Slavic Accord. Support for the Commonwealth is growing apace. Today, the 5 Central Asian republics signed and sealed a statement which says they are ready to join. At first, they'd been hostile to the Commonwealth, not so much the idea of it, rather the fact that they were not consulted about last week's agreement. I hope this accord will stick, said Nursultan Nazarbayev, the leader of Kazakhstan, and his was the key signature today. Kazakhstan is the only republic outside the 3 Slavic states with nuclear weapons. The Central Asian republics, with their impoverished economies, had little choice but to work within the Commonwealth. Decades of rule from the Kremlin have left them heavily dependent on their richer neighbors in the north. The recent resurgence of Islam here made many people fear these republics might form their own power bloc. But now they're coming into the Commonwealth, and once 9 or 10 republics do join, Mr. Gorbachev has said he'll go. Effectively, that moment has now arrived. As well as the 3 founders of the Commonwealth, Two others, Moldova and Armenia, have promised their support. And today the 5 Central Asian states have also said that they will join. That makes the 10 that Mr. Gorbachev said would be the trigger for his departure. Boris Yeltsin, who was planning strategy with Russian deputies today, now seems to be receiving a gradual handover of power from Mr. Gorbachev. They had 2 sets of talks today. Apparently the future of the armed forces, and in particular of nuclear weapons here, were high on their agenda. President Gorbachev is particularly worried about what's going on in Ukraine. There, the republic's leader, Leonid Kravchuk, has declared himself commander-in-chief of his republic's armed forces. But in a phone conversation with Mr. Gorbachev today, he gave an assurance that does not include command over strategic nuclear weapons. Tonight, the Soviet Defense Minister Yevgeny Shapashnikov went on television to promise the West there is no danger. Both strategic and tactical nuclear weapons, he said, will remain under central control. He also ruled out another coup. I can declare with full authority, he said, that the military are peaceful and there cannot be a putsch without them. But as the Soviet state breaks up, the other great fear is of escalating ethnic unrest and social disintegration. In the Republic of Moldova, there may have been a foretaste of that today. 13 people are said to have been killed during gun battles in a region where Russian nationalists oppose the Moldovan government's drive for independence. The test will be whether the new Commonwealth calms such conflicts or simply makes them worse. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
Despite President Gorbachev's assertion that he won't be resigning just yet, the people of the Soviet Union are anticipating his political demise. But they're uncertain about how smooth a transition their new political masters can achieve.
This evening's Izvestia newspaper appeared to have already consigned President Gorbachev and the Soviet Union to oblivion. The front page led on the Central Asian Republic's decision to join the new Commonwealth and the American Secretary of State's analysis of the situation. One of Izvestia's chief commentators says Mr. Gorbachev will go down in history as a man of contradictions.
If everything goes ahead in the democratic direction he started, he'll be credited for it. History will forgive him for his weakness in running the country. But in the short term, there's not very much sympathy. People associate him with the drop in living standards.
That view was borne out in the streets.
I really appreciate all the things he has done. If we take glasnost and so on, it's really great, because now we're free people. It's normal. But well, if we take economical situation, well, you can see everything is horrible.
Mr. Gorbachev ruined our country, I think so. And all these problems now, it's his fault, I think.
Some of Mr. Gorbachev's less inhibited critics, supporters of the unified Soviet Empire, have been openly celebrating his demise. Thousands of officials in the Soviet Foreign Ministry and other central departments, now scheduled for abolition, have little reason to feel any more charitable towards Mr. Gorbachev. But some, like the Foreign Ministry spokesman Vitaly Churkin, can at least joke about it.
Well, we'll join the ranks of the unemployed, I guess.
Others have been left with the feeling that the old system has been hastily destroyed before a new one has been devised. No one has thought through how the transfer of power from the Soviet Union to the Commonwealth of Independent States will work, but it can only be a matter of time before the red flag here is lowered and the Kremlin becomes a symbol of Russian, not Soviet might. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
President Bush has said he will continue to back those in the Soviet Union who favour democracy and reform. He's declined to write off Mr. Gorbachev despite the Soviet leader's increasing isolation.
President Bush planning an international coalition to mobilize and coordinate aid for the former Soviet Union is still reluctant to declare Mikhail Gorbachev politically finished.
This is not a helpful time to editorialize on personalities inside the Soviet Union. We're supporting those who are reform, we're supporting those who are for democracy, whoever they are, wherever they are, in whatever republic they are, and in the center.
Mr. Bush took a telephone call from the Russian President Boris Yeltsin and was again reassured on the question of the safety of nuclear weapons.
We got interest in the fundamental interest and responsibility to the whole world for the nuclear weapons question. We want to see that that is handled with the maximum amount of safety, and the assurances from the center and from the republic has been very good on that, incidentally.
Secretary of State Baker leaves tomorrow for the 4 key republics that have nuclear weapons on their soil, and he denied the Bush administration was backpedaling on recognizing the political reality of the new Commonwealth.
If you notice, I am going to those republics that were the first to subscribe to the Commonwealth, and we are not reluctant to see it for what it is as a very, very important event, but it is still in train. The process is still ongoing, and therefore we should not do anything that would be perceived as injecting ourselves into an internal political debate.
As Washington settles down to celebrate Christmas, the Bush administration has been criticized in Congress for not doing enough quickly enough in aid. But next week, the first U.S. food shipments will leave for cities in the former Soviet Union, tidings of comfort, if not much joy. Gavin Esler, BBC News, Washington.
The Trade and Industry Secretary Peter Lilly has urged British firms to boost their trade links with the Soviet Union. Speaking in the Commons, he said Western firms had to help restore the Soviet economy from the devastation wrought by socialism.
Business has been anything but booming for Soviet firms touting for trade at this London exhibition. Out of 4,000 British companies which expressed an interest in the event, only a fraction have actually turned up. And when it comes to real investment, the republics are finding big business reluctant to take the plunge.
Big projects like, you know, that BP and British Gas and other which is need very huge investment. They're of course very, you know, that careful.
Mrs. Thatcher led the way last year at the British Trade Fair in Kiev, but British business has yet to follow. In 1989, the Soviet Union imported £680 million worth of goods from the United Kingdom, down to 600 million in 1990. But this year, it's estimated that figure will have been halved. It's not just because we can't or won't sell, but because they can't afford to buy. Now, more than ever, the government wants British companies to set up shop over there.
The most painful part of the economic legacy of socialism and communist control is the fearful cost of transition back from socialism to a market economy. And bold steps are needed to achieve that.
But the Soviet Union, for want of a newer name, is the last place to look for a quick profit. Political turmoil and ethnic unrest, coupled with an unconvertible currency and rampant inflation, add up to a high risk by anyone's standards.
One has to be very careful, and particularly in terms of selling to the Soviet Union, you want to make sure you're properly secured by letters of credit or other certain means of getting paid.
Doing business in the Soviet Union is indeed a gamble, but one which could pay massive dividends. And the competition, Germany, Japan and France, is already ahead of Britain and playing for high stakes.
The police officer who led the investigation...
Mr. Gorbachev has agreed to give up his powers to the new Commonwealth of Independent States and will resign. He's staying on as caretaker president, his spokesman Mr. Alexander Likotal told our Moscow correspondent Penny Marshall in an exclusive interview tonight. But the transfer of power and Mr. Gorbachev's resignation will come within weeks, possibly days, he said. Until then, Soviet nuclear weapons stay under his command. All this was agreed during phone calls with Boris Yeltsin and Leonid Kravchuk, the Ukrainian president. Mr. Gorbachev accepted the legality of the new Commonwealth, Mr. Likotal said, but felt betrayed by the Slav republics which started it, Mr. Yeltsin's Russia, Belarus and the Ukraine. Today, 5 Muslim republics, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkestan and Tajikistan, agreed in principle to join the Commonwealth.
This evening at the Kremlin, an end of another round of crisis negotiations. The last to leave, Yevgeny Shaposhnikov, the Soviet defense minister, after discussions with Mr. Gorbachev about the fate of the nuclear arsenal. The Soviet president, in sharp contrast to yesterday, looked relaxed when he met American journalists in his office this afternoon. It now appears he's fought for continued control of the military and won. His personal spokesman told ITN tonight that both Russia and the Ukraine had agreed to it until such time as they've set up their own mechanism for joint control.
For the time being and for the nearest future, the military forces will remain under the central control.
He also revealed that Mr. Gorbachev is no longer fighting against the Commonwealth, accepting it as a political reality. He still apparently considers it to be a mistake, with grave consequences. But now the president is eager to help. Then he will resign.
There are lots of problems, and he is a responsible politician. He can't leave country in such a way. So he wants to do everything he can to provide for a constitutional transition period.
Boris Yeltsin spoke to Mr. Gorbachev twice on the phone today. His position strengthened as the 5 Central Asian republics have voted to back his Commonwealth. A man now close to achieving his political vision. But there are already some signs of what problems may lie ahead. In Moldova, clashes between ethnic Russians who oppose Yeltsin's Commonwealth and Interior Ministry troops left 13 dead. There remains the personal toll on Mikhail Gorbachev and wife Raisa, last seen together when they returned to Moscow after the abortive August coup. Yesterday, Mr. Gorbachev was clearly showing the strains, and he's let it be known that Raisa has not recovered from the trauma. And what of Mr. Gorbachev himself now?
Well, he's a great man. And of course, I suppose anyone would feel inside betrayed in such a situation.
Mr. Gorbachev has not only accepted defeat, it's now clear he's making plans for his own retirement, remaining as a caretaker only as long as he's needed by those who've stripped him of his power. Penny Marshall, News at 10, Moscow.
The American Secretary of State, Mr. James Baker, is setting off this weekend for Moscow and other capital cities in the new Commonwealth. He'll be talking about Soviet nuclear weapons, on which he said President Bush had had a very reassuring phone call from President Yeltsin of Russia, and about economic aid. He said that what was happening in the old Soviet Union could affect the rest of the world.
On Moscow's Lenin Hills, Russian newlyweds celebrate their marriage. Behind them, the lights of the city burn brightly. They may not for much longer. Several towns are already blacked out through lack of fuel. The lights are going out across the land. People queue for petrol, but the pumps are running dry. It's said prices will increase 5-fold. And for shoppers, empty shelves and rampant inflation. This Moscow supermarket had only cabbage and potatoes. Russians are survivors, says the checkout lady. When the cabbage runs out, they'll have to eat grass. This is where the crisis is really reaching breaking point. Politicians wrangle, consumers struggle to survive. The greatest danger may come when frustration turns to rage. In the front line, families like the Ogorodnikovs. Igor, the meteorologist whose salary goes nowhere. A week's pay, 200 rubles for one sausage. Wife Masha, increasingly desperate.
We not believe in future as we believed some years ago.
And children, Nadia and Daniel, surviving on a diet of pickled fruit. Masha tries to call friends in the country for provisions, but even the phones conspire against her. What matters now is street sense. They queued a week for this vodka at 12 rubles a bottle. They'll sell it for 80 to buy clothes. No shortages yet at the private markets, but the food here is beyond most pockets. A single chicken costs 150 rubles. A year ago, it was 30. Life goes on, of course. The Ogorodnikovs aren't starving yet, but winter fills them with trepidation. For the children of the Gorbachev era, the cupboard is bare. Tim Hewitt, News at 10, Moscow.
As Moscow pensioners queued for boxes of food aid from the West and their country's economic systems continued to disintegrate, there was a firm word from the United States today. The former Soviets have to sort out their own political future without interference from the West.
We cannot, and we must not, inject ourselves into this purely political process. And as the President made clear at the Cabinet meeting yesterday and again in comments this morning, we will not so inject ourselves.
But if James Baker was determined to keep out of Soviet politics, he was equally determined that the West should help prevent Soviet anarchy by increasing its aid. In London today, officials from the G7 group of the wealthiest nations met to work out better ways to get aid to the people who need it. The Soviet food distribution system is as rotten as much of the food that eventually reaches the consumers. Some experts believe we could soon see a return to the days of the Berlin airlift, a constant stream of aircraft flying in supplies to prevent starvation.
I think it would take a vast amount of infrastructure from the West. It would take airlifts, for example, to the major urban centers. It would take road transport of military convoys. It would take the involvement of both the Red Army and probably Western advisors and military forces to actually achieve distribution, because one of the big problems is putting grain into the Soviet Union and leaving it there. It's a black hole. It won't get to the people.
The aid effort so far has been led by Europe. There's some resentment from EC officials that the US hasn't done more. The G7 developed countries have committed $11 billion worth of aid to the Soviet Union. $2.4 billion is committed jointly by the EC. Billions more have been committed by individual EC countries like Germany and Britain. The United States has committed $3.9 billion in agricultural credits.
We are now looking at a country which is many times the size of Europe, with 290 million people, which is right next door to us and capable, if it blows up, of impinging upon our security, our financial markets, our well-being. And so I think this is a very different matter. This is a matter of maintaining the strategic security and interests of the West.
Today in London, an extraordinary footnote. Boris Pankin, the new Soviet ambassador to the Court of St. James, went to Buckingham Palace to present his credentials. For 11 weeks after the coup, Mr. Pankin was Soviet foreign minister. Today, bemused, he hardly knew what parts of his disintegrating country he could still represent.
The Prime Minister today paid tribute to President Gorbachev and his achievements in bringing about the changes in Eastern Europe as well as the Soviet Union. In his first full-length interview for 6 months, Mr. Major told ITN's political editor that Mr. Gorbachev was a great historical figure. Michael Brunson also asked about the rise in inflation last month to 4.3%, the first increase since September last year. The Prime Minister said inflation would bubble at 4% between now and April or May, and then decrease gently.
Great historical figure. And had he not been there, and had he not behaved as he did, I doubt we would have seen, in the form in which they have occurred, the very remarkable and welcome changes we've seen throughout Eastern Europe, in the Soviet Union, and of course the vitally important arms accords that he reached with President Reagan and President Bush. He says that he believes his life's work may be fulfilled. Well, I wonder.
And in all this, still, whatever happens, Mr. Gorbachev has had a quite extraordinary part to play, in your view.
In my view, quite extraordinary. If it hadn't been for the Gorbachev phenomenon, we may not now have been looking at a completely changed map in Europe.
You got your way at Maastricht to the extent...
There's a political process that is going on there, and it is an internal matter that we really should not involve ourselves in, and we have not involved ourselves in it.
Good evening. As the Soviet Union crumbles into the dust of 20th century history, America is keeping its options wide open. The uncertainty in the East is mirrored, if not magnified, in the West. One question uppermost in the minds of Western leaders is whose fingers are going to be on the button of the Soviet nuclear arsenal, now that the Soviet Union no longer exists. Britain's Defense Secretary Tom King tells us why the fragmentation of the nuclear superstate is so worrying. And we'll be looking at Boris Yeltsin, his life, times and motivation, and asking one of his closest advisors what Yeltsin's future will be if some of his reforms don't work. Also, to consider whether the collapse of the Soviet Empire was inevitable and where it might all lead, I'll be joined in the studio by a leading historian and by a top Russian economist. And from Washington, we'll be hearing from Sir Charles Pole, former foreign policy advisor to Number 10. President of a rapidly diminishing union is still hanging on to his job, at least until Monday, when he'll receive the American Secretary of State, James Baker. And bowing to the inevitable, Mr. Gorbachev today said the new Commonwealth of Independent States is constitutionally correct. Yesterday, he'd said it was the biggest mistake since the beginning of perestroika. Hand in hand with this latest Russian revolution has come further economic disintegration. In London, officials of the G7 industrialized nations agreed to step up efforts to get emergency food aid to Moscow and Minsk. American military planes will deliver the first supplies next week. The disintegration of what was the Soviet Union gathered pace today as the 5 Central Asian republics decided they too would join Russia, the Ukraine and Belarus in the new Commonwealth of Independent States. But the 5 insisted they must be granted the status of co-founders, and the president of Kazakhstan, the largest of the Asian republics, made clear his irritation with the Slav states' precipitate action.
It's a shame that on the 14th of November, we signed one document, and 2 weeks later, we sign another. Let's hope that this will be the last one.
President Gorbachev had threatened to resign yesterday if 9 or 10 republics signed up for the Commonwealth. As that looked more and more like a reality today, his stance suddenly shifted. His spokesman said there would be no immediate resignation and added that Gorbachev no longer considered the Commonwealth was unconstitutional. It was, in fact, becoming broader and more representative. The Commonwealth now includes most of what was the Soviet Union. The 5 Central Asian republics, plus the 3 Slav republics, bring to 8 those who've turned their backs on Mr. Gorbachev's planned union of sovereign states. Armenia has said it is seriously considering joining, and Azerbaijan today said it too was in favour. The significance of today's announcement has not been lost on the West, but President Bush wouldn't yet put his backing behind the Commonwealth or withdraw his support from Gorbachev.
It's not a helpful time to editorialize on personalities inside the Soviet Union. We're supporting those who are reform, we're supporting those who are for democracy, whoever they are, wherever they are, in whatever republic they are, and in the center.
But it was the Soviet nuclear arsenal that was worrying NATO leaders at their meeting today.
Absolutely essential, in our view, is that the current changes in political and state structures do not lead to a proliferation of nuclear weapons and their control.
And there are other doubts about the future of the new Commonwealth. At least 13 people died today in clashes between government forces and Russian separatists in Moldova. Mr. Gorbachev's prediction yesterday that we are priming a bomb that will sooner or later blow our society apart could yet come true. The disintegration of the Soviet Union leaves the world's biggest nuclear arsenal divided between 4 separate republics. NATO defense ministers have been discussing how those 30,000 weapons can be controlled. After he returned from the NATO meeting, the Defense Secretary Tom King spoke to Peter Snow.
Secretary of State, do you and your NATO colleagues think there's any danger, any threat to the West in what's happening in the breakup of the Soviet Union?
Yes, it obviously is a very worrying situation when you have a major military superpower, a major nuclear power as well, which is suddenly fragmenting, the control structures going, the question as to whether there's going to continue to be a central armed forces, a central control. There is at the moment. We're satisfied at the moment that the Soviet General Staff, that those guarding the nuclear weapons are answering to them, and that there is an overall control. But as you know, we have movements from Ukraine to claim responsibility and command over forces there. And so it is a time of change, and we're watching it very carefully indeed.
As the Soviet Union breaks up, albeit into some kind of commonwealth, do you think it's going to be possible to maintain any kind of single command of nuclear weapons, as NATO thinks is so important?
I think it's much better. There's no question about that. And I think that's what's felt. The latest reports we have, both President Yeltsin, President Yavchuk, both saying that they, for the Ukraine, that they're interested in being commander-in-chief or taking responsibility for the conventional forces, but that they see the strategic forces falling under some, they're talking of course about a Commonwealth arrangement, perhaps to replace the Soviet Union. Some central body in which perhaps it's the continuation of the existing central control staff that continue to control the strategic weapons.
But Secretary of State, where is the single command within all this shambles? Who's going to be in charge?
The present structure is there. My latest information, I checked just before I'm speaking to you now, that we believe that there is still the command structure working, that those who are actually guarding the nuclear weapons are still responding to the instructions, they're still being paid of the Soviet General Staff under central control.
Could you have some system, as some of the republics are suggesting today, where you have 4 keys on each nuclear weapon, so that each republic effectively has to turn a key to release that nuclear weapon? Or is that far too complicated?
At the moment, there is this, as you know, not a single key, and there is this interlock system which gives some protection. But this is precisely what we are establishing at the present time, and precisely the things that we want to discuss, to see if it's possible for us to bring to bear some of our technical resource, if it's needed, to help them, if it's a question, for instance, of immunizing, de-arming some of these weapons, if that is what people want to see happen.
Do you agree with the CIA, whose director believes that there'll be civil war in the collapsing Soviet Union this winter?
Well, one obviously hopes it won't happen. This new situation, it depends how serious I think the winter is, how real are the fears that we have at the moment about food supply, how serious are the worries about the galloping rate of inflation. President Yeltsin has just taken on responsibility for paying the army. He's going to give them a 90% pay increase next month, which is an indication of something of the things that are happening with inflation. Now, how badly some of those developments go could be very worrying. And then, of course, there are the potentials with border disputes, with enclaves, as we know, the phrase that we've got to understand from Yugoslavia. Those situations are replicated in the Soviet Union. We hope that good sense does prevail.
The Russian President Boris Yeltsin tried to reassure President Bush about nuclear weaponry when the two spoke today on the phone. It was their second phone conversation in 5 days, and a sure sign the Americans recognize that Mr. Yeltsin is the man they're going to have to deal with now, rather than Mr. Gorbachev. But what manner of man is Boris Yeltsin? Julian O'Halloran's been assessing the dominant force in whatever replaces the old Union.
When Boris Yeltsin made his pact with the leaders of Ukraine and Belarus last Sunday, he did so with a decisive speed which typifies his career. He had seen that Ukraine's independence vote 7 days before had transformed Russia's struggle against Gorbachev's Union. Yeltsin grew up poor in the province of Sverdlovsk. He was top of the class, but always close to being expelled. It set the pattern for his brief stint as a party boss. He became a local party functionary capable of uttering the kind of thoughts and platitudes essential to political survival in the era of Brezhnev.
Отмечает титаническую деятельность Центрального комитета КПСС, Политбюро ЦК, лично Леонида Ильича Брежнева, его выдающуюся личную роль в выработке и осуществлении внутренней и внешней политики.
But when Gorbachev brought him to prominence as party chief in Moscow in 1985, Yeltsin was to take up the task of reforming the old party system with an almost reckless zeal. He showed his egalitarian instincts, riding on a bus for the cameras to point up the cars and privileges provided for party functionaries. Populism and a flair for the right kind of publicity were to serve him well when democratic change began. But that was still some way off. Yeltsin's willingness to confront head-on what was rotten in the party system was to be at first his undoing. Given a seat on the Politburo, he launched the kind of open and direct assaults on established ideas and practices which even in the era of Gorbachev and Glasnost were too much for his colleagues to take. In 1987, he was summoned from his sickbed and unceremoniously sacked by Gorbachev.
Yeltsin really believed that we were moving ahead to some kind of restoration of the kind of straight talking of the ideals of democracy and equality, which were proclaimed in 1917. And he went straight ahead and pushed back the frontiers as fast as he could. And when people began to complain about it, Yeltsin believed that Gorbachev would back him. At that stage, of course, he was failing to understand how Soviet bureaucratic politics really worked. He thought it had changed a lot more than it really had.
However, Yeltsin used all his intuition and flair to combat his enemies and relaunch his political career by being elected to the Congress of People's Deputies in 1989. At this time, his relationship with Gorbachev was stormy because of Gorbachev's reluctance to go for high-speed economic reform. But to Yeltsin, events in the Baltic republics in January this year were to be the decisive turning point. In Lithuania, Soviet forces used naked terror to try and suppress the final push for national independence, killing 14 and injuring hundreds. Yeltsin makes clear in his memoirs this had a profound impact on himself and other republic leaders.
A national conflict could flare up in even the most obedient republic, which would lead to the speedy emergence of yet another Council of National Salvation, which would seize power with the aid of weapons and military vehicles with the full approval of the Kremlin. It looks as though, for the first time, the desire for freedom of some, coupled with the fear of the center of others, has united all the republics in resolute opposition to presidential power.
As he campaigned successfully to become Russia's first directly elected president, Yeltsin was becoming convinced of the need for Russia to push harder against the federal model proposed by Gorbachev, and of the need for Russia to have its own armed forces. Watching the daring feats of others, Yeltsin also recognized the source of some of his own courage.
Я вот сейчас думаю, прыгнул бы я, значит, в этот огонь. Нет, все-таки, наверное, вряд ли. Хотя вроде и характер такой хулиганский, но не хватило бы, наверное. А может, прыгнул, знаете, по обстановке судя.
But when he seized the moment during the August coup against Gorbachev, it was heroism, not hooliganism, that impressed the outside world. He pitted his popularity against the divisions of the coup leaders and won. But some still wonder about his unpredictable personality compared with the known and tested Gorbachev.
He's a man who's very sensitive to the public mood. He's a man, I think, who tends to be swayed by advice. And therefore, I think the situation, the outlook with Yeltsin is much more open-ended. One couldn't be confident about stating that this is not someone who would be driven into an authoritarian line of policy if the situation seemed to be pushing in that direction.
Yeltsin bemoans the fact that his life at the top has left him no time for relaxation. But in the turbulent months to come, he may well look back on the struggles of the past as only a preparation for the biggest challenge of his life.
Ethnic rivalries could prove one of Mr. Yeltsin's biggest headaches. Today, 13 people died when police and separatists clashed in Moldova. One expert on such rivalry is Galina Starovoitova, who is also one of Mr. Yeltsin's closest advisors. She spoke to me earlier from Moscow, and I asked her how Mr. Yeltsin was going to allay suspicions of Russia dominating the new Commonwealth.
First of all, Russian Federation willingly refused to be in a role of a big brother. We have recognized the independence of the Baltic countries. We have recognized the independence of the Ukraine, and it is a good proof of our willings, I hope. And Mr. Yeltsin refused from the all territorial pretensions to other republics. And we are, in fact, in equal conditions now.
There are clearly many economic problems. Mr. Yeltsin is a great populist politician, but he has never particularly proved himself as a great administrator, has he? Why should he do better at sorting out the economic difficulties than Mr. Gorbachev did?
The populism is not so negative phenomena in our political life like in the West, because the populism is a form of awakening the people for the political life. And Mr. Yeltsin already gave some proofs of his direction. Mr. Gorbachev have prepared the soil, but Mr. Yeltsin planted the seeds. He already adopted the plan of deep radical economical reforms, and took upon himself a great risk.
But you have still, for instance, to put up prices in Russia. That's not going to happen till next month, and there are clearly worries about feeding people in Moscow and in St. Petersburg. Isn't there a good chance, realistically, that Mr. Yeltsin will fail?
Mr. Yeltsin understands, like all his command, all his team, that we are in a very difficult transitional period, and of course this generation of politicians can be withdrawn as a result of these reforms.
But were you saying, did I understand you right, were you saying earlier that if the reforms do fail, then Mr. Yeltsin might be prepared to stand down?
If the reforms will fail, Mr. Yeltsin will not stay in his position. It's clear. But we are afraid that we shall be in that case replaced not by the democratical powers. I am afraid it will be a new form of totalitarianism.
And very briefly, should Mr. Gorbachev now resign?
I was his opponent in parliament, but now it would be so pity for me if he will resign. I think it is not a good time. I mean, to say more exactly, maybe it is too late, maybe it is too early to resign for him. I hope he will find his new role in new Commonwealth.
Well, from Maastricht to Moscow and Minsk, it's been a week of momentous change in Europe, with visions of a new union of nations in the West and the continued disintegration of an old union in the East. To discuss the historical tensions and the personalities and politics underlying these changes, I'm joined now by Dr. Raia Simonyan of the Institute for World Economy in Moscow, by Professor Norman Davis of the School of Slavonic Studies at London, and from Washington by Sir Charles Powell, former foreign policy advisor at Number 10. Gentlemen, can I start briefly by asking all of you if you think there was any one single moment when Mr. Gorbachev went wrong? Professor Davis.
There are many. I think perhaps his most obvious mistake was to shift away from reliance on the Communist Party, which was always the pillar of the old dictatorship, towards the structures of the Soviet state. The Soviet state, if I may say, has been very little more than a facade, something of the biggest communist front in the history of the world, and it really had no substance. Once the Communist Party was weakened, then the Soviet state, I think, was almost bound to collapse.
So the Communist Party was the glue that held the whole thing together?
Much more than the glue. That was the state. The Politburo was the executive centre, that was the cabinet. The Central Committee was the Parliament. The institutions of the state were really just administrative branches of the party. And to put your faith in these subsidiary organisations was really to step onto a collapsing platform.
Dr. Simonyan, any one moment when Mr. Gorbachev got it wrong?
Yeah, being an economist, I think that the situation with the 500 days program was a crucial moment in the fate of Mr. Gorbachev, because the population was expecting radical measures, and he couldn't deliver those measures, and there was a disappointment. And after that, he couldn't regain his position among the Democrats and radicals.
Sir Charles, what do you think?
I take a slightly different view. I think there was a fundamental contradiction in President Gorbachev's position. He was using the instruments and the means of the old system to create a new one. And the logic of that is that should he succeed, then he himself would be swept away by the changes. So I think, in a sense, there was an inevitability about it.
So you would say it was inevitable?
Yes, I would say it was inevitable because of the changes which he himself was making in the system. He himself could not in the end survive.
Professor Davis, do you think that it was perhaps inevitable, given that by his liberalisation, President Gorbachev was unleashing forces that had been perhaps stepped on, clamped down since the end of the 19th century?
Certainly that was the case, but the point about Mr. Gorbachev is that from the beginning to the end, he has been the unelected Secretary General of the Communist Party. And not only unelected, but extremely unpopular, the head of a system which is resented and hated from the last 70 years. And for him to begin to introduce a democratic system was, as Sir Charles said, the beginning of his own end. He could not himself move from being the head of the communist dictatorship to being the democratic leader.
Dr. Simonyan, is there anything the West could have done, had it been so minded, to have saved him?
I don't know whether Mr. Gorbachev would like to be saved by the West, because he was and is a personality, and he is a historic figure. And I think that, he won't assume such a help, if it is provided.
Sir Charles, do you think the West could have saved Gorbachev?
I don't think it was our job to save Mr. Gorbachev. That's really his future lies in the hands of the people in the Soviet Union, or the former Soviet Union. But I do think we have to avoid being too negative about this. People have short memories, you know. What Mr. Gorbachev achieved in those 5 years at the very top of the Soviet system was quite remarkable. The freeing of Eastern Europe, the reunification of Germany, the reduction in the vast Soviet military machine, the reduction in nuclear weapons, the social and economic changes on which he embarked, the introduction of democracy. Those are fantastic changes.
Okay, well, let's just look to the future. Should the West back Yeltsin now?
Well, I don't think it's a question of us backing one person or the other. We have to deal with whoever is de facto the authority or the authorities in those republics. Clearly, the way events are developing, authority is beginning to slip away from President Gorbachev, and some of the individual Republican leaders are assuming more and more authority. One can see that, for instance, in the pattern of communications between the United States and Mr. Yeltsin. That channel seems to be growing in strength, while the channel to Mr. Gorbachev appears to be declining. That, I'm afraid, is a process which we can't control. We just have to react to it.
Dr. Simonyan, do you think that Mr. Yeltsin can survive for very long the sort of economic traumas that he's clearly going to have to go through?
It's a crucial question, in my view, because for a long time Mr. Yeltsin was in opposition to existing regime and was fighting against something. Now he has the responsibilities, and he should deliver something positive to the electorate who supported him. And the situation, economic situation, is extremely bad, and it is not a bottom line yet. So the
you mean it's going to get worse?
I think so, because now he has a good team, in my view, an economic team, who started the process of radicalization of economic reform. But the more radical is reform, the situation might be more difficult for the population. And you see, I don't know how tolerant is or might be the electorate.
Well, briefly, how would you rate his chances?
I think that he should deliver positive changes within the first half a year. If there is no improvement in the economic day-to-day life of the people, you see, I don't think that he might
He's
survive.
had it.
Yes.
Professor Davis, there's been quite a lot of gloom and doom about, to put it mildly, from Mr. Gorbachev, from James Baker. Do you think we are seeing, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, are we seeing the redrawing almost of a 19th century style map of Europe? Western Europe, not so much the East. We've got trouble in Yugoslavia, the Balkanization of Central Europe. Are we going back to the 19th century?
Oh no, I think we're moving way beyond the 19th century. I think the Western Europe is in a fluid state, is changing. Eastern Europe is changing even more rapidly. It's clear that the new building blocks of the future in the East are going to be the new national republics which are emerging, which is something which happened, of course, in Central and parts of Western Europe in the 19th century. And this process is now coming, I think, to its logical conclusion. I think our governments have been rather slow in recognizing these new building blocks that we...
Should we welcome it more? Should we?
Oh yes, I think it's the Soviet Union was a very artificial amalgamation of nationalities. It was not a force for for the good. Its collapse is, of course, extremely dangerous, but it was, I think we've said, almost inevitable. And I think we should have put our faith in the new blocs and try to encourage them as much as we can.
You say it's extremely dangerous. A lot of people are warning of war in Western Europe. I mean, the whole thing's spilling over into Western Europe. Do you think that's going to happen?
I've no reason to think that. I think there has been quite a lot of gloom and warmongering, not least from Mr. Gorbachev. Some of the things that he said about Ukraine, I think, were very irresponsible. Of course, there always is a chance of strife and conflict, but it should surely be the duty of senior leaders to try and hold things together, not to arouse passions.
Dr. Simonian, do you think that Europe, Western Europe as well as the East, is going to be a safer, more secure place once things settle down, or do you think there's a big question mark over that?
It is a big question mark, because the situation in the former Soviet Union to some extent is unpredictable, and the danger of the possible ethnic conflict is a real danger. And within the new Commonwealth, the problems of borders, of relations between different ethnic groups, whether in Ukraine or in Kazakhstan, might be a big issue. And to some extent, for the West, it was easier to live with a totalitarian, the Soviet Union, which was quite predictable. And the whole post-war history showed that within the rules of the game which were established, it could be possible to deal with the Soviet Union.
Sir Charles, if I can go to you finally, do you think Europe, West as well as East, is going to be a safer, more secure place?
I feel I missed some of the preceding discussion, Sue, but I think we're going to face a very difficult period of some years now. The strength in the new system is that it's a bottom-up system, whereas President Gorbachev's was a top-down one. That said, I don't think the pendulum has necessarily swung for the last time. We've gone from highly centralized authority in the Soviet Union to a very loose federation. I think over time the pendulum may swing back a bit more towards the middle, and some sort of quite modest central authority will be re-established. And of course, in a way, from the point of view of other countries, that's an easier system to deal with. But while that process is going on, we face the possibility of instability, quite dangerous instability, and there'll be a great responsibility on Western Europe to try to alleviate that through practical and technical and financial help, through food, and through extending political contacts to the various new republics which are emerging.
Gentlemen, thank you all very much indeed, and I'm sorry we lost sound briefly there from Washington. In a moment, the attempt to turn the tables on those that hunt with dogs.
Request to the American Secretary of State James Baker after his arrival today in Moscow. Mr. Baker says his priority is to make sure Soviet nuclear weapons are in safe and responsible control. A report from Ann Lucas at ITN.
James Baker faces a round of talks with the leaders of the 4 states within the newly declared Commonwealth. First, the Russian Foreign Minister Andrei Kazyrov. He called for international diplomatic recognition of the independent states.
This will help to crystallize authority which stems from the people's vote in Ukraine and Russia and in Belarus, and stop the disintegration, further disintegration in this part of the world.
For the most part, these are essentially political issues that are internal issues here. And we've made it clear, I made it clear, President Bush has made it clear in the United States that it is not up to the United States to involve ourselves in these political issues.
Most of the Soviet nuclear arsenal is based in Russia, Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan. And early discussions indicate that their leaders will place the nuclear weapons under a single control. The Ukrainian President, Leonid Kravchuk, says the new Commonwealth will aim for complete nuclear disarmament. In Moscow, marchers demonstrated against Boris Yeltsin's proposed lifting of food price controls, an issue which has just brought the resignation of the mayor of Moscow.
Tomorrow, Germany will press for the European community to recognize the Yugoslavian republics of Croatia and Slovenia as independent states. It will raise the issue at a meeting of foreign ministers. Today, the United Nations agreed to send a team of observers to Yugoslavia. It could pave the way for a peacekeeping force.
Good evening. The American Secretary of State, James Baker, arrived in Moscow to check guarantees about the control of nuclear weapons and walked into a formal request for the United States to recognize the new Soviet republic's independence from the Kremlin. The Russian Foreign Minister, Andrei Kozyrev, said such a move would help crystallize authority and stop further disintegration. But Mr. Baker said that the US wouldn't interfere in the internal political struggle between the republics and President Gorbachev, although he did refer to the former Soviet Union. Ukraine's President Kravchuk said earlier that the leaders of the new Commonwealth of Republics aim to destroy all nuclear weapons on their territory.
James Baker has come here today with what he says are specific proposals to deal with this disintegrating country's 27,000 nuclear weapons. He'll offer his hosts technical and perhaps financial help as well to destroy their vast nuclear stockpile. But as central authority here collapses, Mr. Baker's short-term worry is exactly who controls the Soviet arsenal now, President Gorbachev or the republics. Tonight, when Mr. Baker met the Russian foreign minister, he was told it's about time America recognizes the independence of the separate republics here, including Russia itself.
Basically, we do ask now for full diplomatic recognition of independent states in this part of the world, those which created this new Commonwealth.
But the Secretary of State was cautious.
We will obviously be looking at the suggestion that has been made here, the request that has been made, just as we are now looking at a similar request from Ukraine. And one of the reasons for this trip, of course, was to go by Kiev and discuss with Ukrainian leaders some suggestions and representations and considerations that the United States thinks are important in looking at the questions, of diplomatic recognition.
Mr. Kozyrev promised that neither Russia nor the other republics would ever use their nuclear weapons. But tonight there were signs of division among the radical reformers in the Russian leadership. The mayor of Moscow, Gavril Popov, resigned, citing differences with his president, Boris Yeltsin, and saying he cannot carry on when he's not being allowed to do what he promised his electorate. Ben Brown, BBC News, Moscow.
The collapse of rule from the centre is bringing not just economic and political chaos, but the prospect of more clashes at ethnic flashpoints on the fringes of the Union. And in Moscow today, supporters of the old order have been on the march.
The defenders of the old Soviet Union were out in force in Moscow today, demanding that both Presidents Yeltsin and Gorbachev be put on trial for allowing their country to fall apart. Scuffles between pro- and anti-Yeltsin demonstrators are not unusual these days, but what happened next was. When the communist diehards set out to deliver a petition to the Kremlin, the police obliged by removing the barriers to Red Square. There was a moment of panic when it looked as though they might storm the Kremlin, and the great wooden doors of this medieval fortress were swiftly shut. On one thing, the demonstrators and Mr. Gorbachev agree, that the disintegrating empire is an ethnic powder keg. And there's been fresh evidence of that from the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. In scenes reminiscent of the fighting in Yugoslavia, Azerbaijani gunmen have stepped up their attacks on the Armenian-dominated capital, Stepanakert. In the latest twist of their long-running conflict with the Azerbaijanis, the Armenians of Nagorno-Karabakh want to join the Commonwealth of Independent States. But as the casualties mount up and the hatred grows, it seems doubtful whether such a move would bring peace to the region. Here and in a dozen more flashpoints, there's ample confirmation of Mr. Gorbachev's warning that the collapse of the Union is a bomb that could blow Soviet society apart. Angus Roxburgh, BBC News, Moscow.
More than 500 people are thought to have drowned when an Egyptian ferry hit a coral reef and sank in the Red Sea.
John, nice to see you here.
Hello.
And good morning. President Gorbachev changed the face of the world and brought freedom to millions of Soviet people after decades of communist tyranny. but the empire is now crumbling. Is Gorbachev's legacy of freedom no more than a chaos which threatens to engulf all of us? What's actually happening in the Soviet Union now, Isabel?
Well, I was in Moscow recently, and there's very little food. There's no milk, there's no bread. It's quite difficult to live, really. People I was staying with didn't really give me much to eat. Fried potatoes for 3 days.
Do they feel beleaguered and under pressure?
I think they do. I mean, I think it's not a question of enjoying what you're eating. It's just eating, really. You don't really care. It's about sort of thinking a couple of hours ahead or whatever.
You were there recently. What was it like?
We were there in March, and we went to a family for lunch one day, and they'd had to collect for months and months of friends and family to get enough food to get one meal to feed us.
What was the meal made of?
There was salami, sausage, and a few potatoes, and like cabbage and things.
But that had taken them months to actually put together and collect.
So bad.
Is it bad?
Yes, it's quite bad, actually. There's a definite possibility of hardship this winter, especially by European standards. And there's a lot of social tension that's building up. The problems seem to be, well, there's a suspicion that these shortages aren't just because the whole distribution system is collapsing, but there are suspicions that they were caused artificially as well.
What do you mean by caused artificially?
Well, there were numerous incidents of
What you mean?
railway cars full of food dumped in the forests, whatever, and
Well, who would want to do that?
Well, there's suspicions that some of the hardliners were keeping the food away from the people, hoping to start a rebellion against the...
So they want to exacerbate the situation, put the blame on Gorbachev or the New Republic's government.
Yes, this is all rumors, actually,
yeah.
but there is a distinct...
But that's the problem, isn't it? When you've got shortages like that, any rumor is given countenance.
Oh, yes, the people take them very seriously. They get very emotional about them.
What are they shortages of? What are the... I mean, is it basic things like potatoes, bread?
Yes, even potatoes are becoming in short supply.
Yeah. Are people going to starve this winter in the Soviet Union, are they?
I would have thought that starvation is not something that's uppermost in people's minds, but people will find things are going to get worse. And everybody that is in the Soviet Union as it was today realises that things are going to get far worse before they get better. And obviously, as Borden has already said, it's going to create greater social pressures. And if somebody is going to be around that's going to feel he can tap that for his own benefit, then maybe you might get a fascist dictator or a communist dictator, whatever political spectrum it might be.
I was in Moscow, Leningrad, and Lithuania earlier, and the situation at that time was very, very grave. There's a grave shortage of food, clothing, medical supplies, and so, of course, on Friday, I telephoned my friends, and I was told then that there was very little milk, almost unobtainable, bread unobtainable, and today the women are walking for approximately 1/2 a day before they can find a shop that has anything at all which they can buy, which they can purchase.
Anthony.
All this is true. The food supply is terrible. But I've been going to the Soviet Union for 10 years, and it was pretty terrible then. And in fact, this is a country which before the revolution was a major exporter of grain to the world. The Soviet peoples have not eaten well since the revolution, and they particularly haven't eaten well since the collectivization of the 1930s. This has been a war economy for all these years, and the major reason, the fundamental reason why people have never eaten well there is because they've spent all their money on guns, tanks, and planes.
I visited the mass graves at Leningrad. You know, they were caused through the 900-day siege, 41 to 44. And the persons now of Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, as we now know it, are in fear of starvation.
But Michael, Anthony is saying it's no different to what it's always been. It's always been a war economy, a war footing. What people are going through now is just dramatic. In a sense, he's saying we're paying more attention to it because of the political circuit. But it's always been like that.
No, not to this extent. Not to this extent.
No, it's true. It's worse now than it's ever been before because that war economy has come to the end of the line, and with it, it has dragged down that central distribution system for everything else, including the food. But without Marks and Spencer's, without those distribution links that we have here and in the Western world, with the centralized state system breaking down, everything is breaking down.
Why is it happening, Mary?
I think, as Anthony says, it is because the central system of distribution has broken down. We're talking about a system which has been run centrally, where if, for example, you were producing milk, you were growing apples, it wasn't up to you to get them to the shops. The old centre has gone, the old ministries, the bodies which told you what to do. You've no way of getting it there. You haven't got a truck, you can't go to a garage and get petrol. It simply doesn't work like that.
Just carry on.
I was there in 1960, the time of Khrushchev, and exactly the same thing went on there. In Moscow, you had no fruit, for example, very little food, very little meat. There were very long queues. 1960, we went to Kiev, which is only 500 miles away, and there was so much fruit it was rotting in the shops. The only reason that the breakdown is now, perhaps worse than before, although I doubt it, is there's no incentive for anyone to do anything. You need the capitalist ethos to get people to want to make a profit, to move food from, not only food, all goods, from one place to another. Until we get that sorted out, there'll be no improvement in the Soviet Union or its successors.
I think the situation is different from the 1960s. I was there for 2 years in the early 60s as a student. The shortages were nothing like they are now, and the big difference was that people looked to the future and things were getting better. If we take from the 60s through to the mid-70s, standard of living rises and products get better.
Are you worried, Sarah, about how all this is going to affect us in the West?
Yes, because I think the reason that everyone is more worried about shortages now is because it's not, the Soviet Union is not a known quantity anymore.
It's not just the shortages, is it? The shortages are a result, perhaps, of the breakdown in the distribution network, but they're also a consequence of the disintegration of political power and the breakup of the Soviet Union itself and the growing vacuum in political power. Do you worry about that disintegration of political power? But, I mean, do you worry, for example, that nuclear weapons are going to...
Definitely. I think everyone... If people aren't worried about that, I think they must be living in cuckoo land.
Is this a real problem?
Yes, I think it's a major problem because at the present time you have got the most, shall we say, left-wing and most extreme communist officers in the Red Army are those who practiced in Afghanistan. For example, you've got General Boris Gromov, who was the Soviet commander in Afghanistan, a man who is a major war criminal, the equal of any Nazi war criminal, who's responsible for 1.5 million deaths in Afghanistan. This man's finger is very close to that trigger, and all his officer corps along with him are the same, what I would call them fascists, who performed so appallingly in Afghanistan, who had no hesitation in torturing, raping and devastating that country. I've been there on several occasions and I've seen the entire country has been devastated by these people who now have their fingers near the button, and that is frightening.
Michael?
I don't think so that the nuclear weapon problem is a real problem at the moment in Soviet Union, because I think that any republic in new conditions don't want to be involved in the war. And if we come to these questions technically, it's impossible to destroy the protect system on the nuclear weapon, and even now in the new Commonwealth it will be of course sort of the central control of all sort of weapons, not only nuclear weapons.
Well, I don't believe that they're going to wage war on each other by nuclear weapons, simply because the deterrent will mean that they know that if they attack one other state, they're going to be attacked themselves and cause immense damage to their own people. The real threat to me is the fear that individuals are going to see an upburst of nationalism, that human rights are going to be denied, that minorities are going to be persecuted, just as they are in Romania, just as they are in Yugoslavia. I think we may see in the Soviet Union a second Yugoslavia, and that is a real worry.
But still on the nuclear weapons, we'll come to all the other issues you've raised, John, but isn't it going to be a Yugoslavia writ large with people actually having possession of nuclear weapons? That's the difference, isn't it? That's the fear.
Yes, I think there's a difference between the sort of war being waged in Yugoslavia and the sort of war that would be waged if they actually used a nuclear...
If Turkestan is going to quarrel with Azerbaijan about the precise boundaries there, or the Ukraine is going to argue with Georgia or Russia or whatever it is about the boundaries, and they're actually in possession of nuclear weapons, they're going to at least threaten to use them, aren't they? Or
they may well talk.
You've got people who have never hesitated to use the most appalling weapons of war, as for example, as I just said, in Afghanistan. You've got people there who have slaughtered and tortured thousands of times. They're not going to worry about slaughtering and torturing again. They're going to do it as soon as they get the chance. You've got nuclear shells, you've got nuclear shells, you've got chemical weapons, which they have the largest supply of chemical weapons in the entire world. They still have the largest war machine in the entire world, and there are a lot of very upset generals and KGB people running around there who have lost all their perks and privileges. They're not going to go down quietly.
The difference, surely, between this situation and Afghanistan is that in Afghanistan they were taking on a very poorly defended country. If they were to use the nuclear deterrent, the nuclear weapon against another state with the nuclear bomb, they know that they would suffer as well. I think it's terribly easy to be a bully when you're dealing with someone who's weak. It's not very easy to be a bully when you're dealing with a strong person.
I believe honestly that there is nothing that they've then to trade off in respect of purchasing any food as what, but they have got the weapons to sell, and you must remember the Gulf War conflict, the Scud missiles that were used were Russian built. Yes. Where did they get these? I spent several years in Iraq on the borders between Russia, and most of the military hardware came from Russia, and the training ground was from Russia. Yeah. And now you must remember that there are Islamic states are setting up inside Russia, and their fundamental beliefs are far greater, I think, than the problems that were encountered inside Russia.
Clearly, we're dealing with an unstable situation, and that's bound to be dangerous. It's very difficult to forecast precisely what will happen. None of us has forecast any of the things that have happened, so how can we forecast now? But one of the factors is that we're dealing with very immature governments. None of the people in power, except those who are communist apparatchiks who've turned, have any experience of government, and their civil service has no government. I think there is danger, especially in the case of tactical weapons.
What's the danger?
The danger is that they'll get into wrong hands, that they will be used either in inter-ethnic strife or be sold to third countries.
I tend to agree with you, because I think that the disintegration of Soviet central power, there is a very great risk that the nuclear weaponry, which is distributed over the 4 republics of Russia, Belarus, Ukraine, and Kazakhstan, may fall...
Come on, I'll come straight. Hold on, I've got a problem with my microphone. It appears that, I assume, is a noise. Thank you. He gets paid for walking on like that, you know.
This nuclear weaponry could fall into wrong hands, but perhaps even more importantly, if the economic situation, the food situation, deteriorates to such a great extent, it may well be that some people, perhaps of the diehards, could seize an opportunity to try and take power and threaten others who might in turn try and attack them. So I think that we should not underestimate the possibility that some kind of force, and maybe even nuclear force, could be resorted to if the situation gets extremely desperate.
We've mentioned Ukraine and we've mentioned nuclear power, and people seem to forget that in 1986 there was the Chernobyl disaster in Ukraine. And Ukraine has a particular experience of nuclear fallout and knows what can happen should nuclear weapons get out of control. Now, that was created by the Soviet system, which was not democratically elected. And today you've got democratically elected governments, like in the Ukraine, who are totally in charge of what's going on. And I would imagine 4 fingers on the nuclear button is better than 1, which we had up until now.
I believe that this gentleman's right. You will not get one person pressing a nuclear button. The way I see it...
But will they sell them?
Will they sell them? I don't think they will sell them.
If they did,
I think they will destroy them. I think they will destroy them.
Why would they want... If they see their populations dying of starvation or malnutrition and all the diseases that accompanies it, and they've got this armament there that they know the rest of the world, the dictators in South America, the little tin pot dictators throughout Africa and the Middle East want them, prepared to pay huge sums of money, they're going to sell them, aren't they?
No, no.
Oh,
Russia...
What makes them so pious?
No, as far as I'm concerned, Russia, right, has made a terrible mistake. They've made a terrible mistake. And I was glad to see Mr. Gorbachev come to sense with Boris Yeltsin, right? And I believe that by talking to the West, we can teach them and they can teach us, especially with the breakup of the states and trying to get independence.
Are they going to sell these?
Well, I don't really think so. I think that one of the main points is that these individual republics, if they're going to survive in the world,
Well, it's not just individual republics.
Well,
it's any kind of local gangly. I mean, what happened in Yugoslavia? It's not just the Yugoslav army invading Croatia from Serbia.
Well,
it's a lot of kind of little tribal chiefs.
Well, I think